The water pitcher beside your bed has frozen solid overnight. Before central heating, Americans woke to breath clouding their bedrooms, frost coating the inside of the windows, and a winter cold that followed them through the house. Children shivered awake beneath every blanket the family owned, while a single fireplace, 20 feet away, stood between them and hypothermia. If its last log had burned out hours earlier, morning began in bitter silence. Then one ordinary object would rewrite the American home, the radiator. This was not a disaster. This was not a war or a plague or an exceptional year of cold. This was simply a Tuesday in January for tens of millions of Americans across several centuries of history. Central heating, the invisible, silent system humming behind every wall in nearly every home and office and school in the modern world, is so ordinary today that most people never think about it at all. But before it existed, winter was not an inconvenience. It was a physical ordeal that shaped how people slept, worked, traveled, built their homes, raised their children, and even how they thought about death. This is the story of how humans lived before central heating, and how one invention quietly ended one of the longest struggles in the entire history of civilization. To understand what central heating actually solved, you have to stop thinking of cold as discomfort and start thinking of it as an adversary. For most of human history, and specifically for the first 250 years of American life, cold was a daily opponent that had to be managed, fought, and sometimes simply endured. The typical American home through the 18th and into the early 19th century was heated almost entirely by open fireplaces. If you were lucky, you had more than one. Most families were not lucky. A standard rural farmhouse might have a single fireplace built into the main room, a combined kitchen, dining room, and living space, and nothing else. Bedrooms were unheated as a matter of course. Attic sleeping lofts, common in frontier homes, were essentially outdoor spaces that happened to have a roof. According to historical accounts from the period, people went to bed in so many layers of clothing that taking them off required real effort. The fireplace itself was a deeply imperfect solution to the cold, and everyone who used one knew it. It radiated heat intensely in a narrow cone directly in front of it, and essentially nowhere else. The back of a room with a roaring fireplace could be close to freezing, while the front was uncomfortably warm. Benjamin Franklin himself, one of the most practically minded inventors who ever lived, described the American colonial fireplace as an almost total failure as a heating device. It sent most of its heat up the chimney, choked rooms with smoke when the wind changed direction, and demanded constant, exhausting attention. A fire that burned through the night required someone to wake and feed it every few hours, or it would die before morning. This was not a minor inconvenience. In a serious winter, a dead fire at 3 in the morning was a genuine danger. Franklin's frustration was the direct inspiration for one of his most famous inventions, the Franklin stove, designed in 1741, a cast-iron enclosure that used a system of baffles to circulate heat more efficiently and send less of it wasted up the flue. It was a real improvement, and it spread widely through colonial America and beyond. But even a Franklin stove, even the best stove of its era, heated the room it sat in and nothing else. Every other room remained cold, and cold meant cold, not uncomfortable, not chilly, but genuinely cold in ways that are difficult to imagine from the perspective of a person who has never lived without central heat. People's relationship with winter was practical and unromantic. You wore your heaviest coat indoors. You kept your work as close to the fire as you could. You cooked over the same fire that heated you, which meant the kitchen was always the warmest room, and the rest of the house took whatever was left over. Wealthy families managed slightly better. They could afford more fireplaces, more servants to tend them, more firewood. But even in the grandest colonial mansions, the rooms that weren't in daily use were simply abandoned to the cold in January. Furniture was covered, pipes were a non-existent problem because there were no pipes, and the family contracted itself into the smallest, warmest core of the house and waited for March. There is a fact about early American life that almost no one talks about today, and it is this: keeping a single household warm through a single New England winter required an almost incomprehensible amount of wood. Historians who have studied the period estimate that a typical New England family in the 18th century burned somewhere between 30 and 40 cords of firewood per year. A cord is a stack of wood 4 feet wide, 4 feet tall, and 8 feet long. Multiply that by 30, stack it in your mind, and you begin to grasp what an enormous physical and economic commitment heating a home actually was. For rural families, cutting, splitting, hauling, and stacking firewood was not a task. It was a season-long occupation. The work of staying warm consumed a substantial portion of every adult man's autumn and much of the physical labor of the entire household. This was not only a personal burden, but an ecological one. The early American forests, which had seemed essentially infinite to the first European settlers, were not. Within a few generations, communities near Boston, New York, and Philadelphia had stripped the surrounding landscape clean of usable timber. As early as the late 1600s, firewood prices in the larger towns were already rising sharply as the nearest trees were consumed and wood had to be hauled from farther and farther away. By the mid-1700s, firewood was a genuine luxury good in many urban areas. Poor families in cities sometimes could not afford enough of it to stay reliably warm through winter. This is where the story of American heating takes its first major turn. Coal was not new. It had been mined and burned in Britain for centuries, but in early America, where forests were still abundant outside the cities, wood had always been the obvious choice. As urban wood prices climbed, and as the Industrial Revolution began to develop the infrastructure to mine, transport, and distribute coal at scale, American cities began to switch. By the early to mid-1800s, coal had become the dominant urban fuel. The portable cast iron range, which replaced the open hearth in many urban kitchens by the middle of the 19th century, burned coal almost exclusively. It was safer and more efficient than an open fire, and it gave city residents a more reliable source of warmth in the main room of the house. But it still left every other room cold, and it still placed the entire burden of heat on a single point, a single stove, tended by hand, burning through expensive fuel that had to be purchased, delivered, and stored. The firewood crisis of early American cities planted the seed of a question that would eventually become central heating. What if heat didn't have to come from a single point? What if you could generate it in one place and move it everywhere else? To live through an unheated American winter was not simply to be cold. It was to have your body in a state of constant low-grade physical stress for months at a time. Hypothermia, in its full clinical sense, requires a significant drop in core body temperature. But the prolonged cold of an unheated house imposed something subtler and in some ways more damaging, a relentless drain on the body's energy reserves as it worked continuously to maintain warmth. People who lived in cold houses ate more, slept more, and still exhausted themselves faster in winter than in summer. Chronic chilblains, painful inflammation of the small blood vessels in the skin caused by repeated exposure to cold without freezing, were so common they barely rated a mention in period accounts. They were simply what your hands and feet felt like in January. Children in particular suffered. Their smaller bodies had less thermal mass and lost heat faster, which is part of why historical infant and child mortality always spiked in winter. The psychological dimension of cold was equally real. Winter compressed life. People moved less, traveled less, entertained less, and created less during the cold months. Historians who have studied the diaries and letters of ordinary Americans from the 18th and early 19th centuries note a consistent shift in tone between summer and winter entries. The winter pages are shorter, grimmer, more inward. The cold was not only physical, it was a mental weight that settled over households for 4 to 5 months every year. Fires themselves introduced a different danger. They killed. House fires were a constant risk in an era when every home depended on open flames for heat, light, and cooking. In the cities, where houses were built close together of wood, a single out-of-control fire could, and frequently did, consume entire blocks. In rural areas, a chimney fire in a remote farmhouse on a January night, miles from neighbors, was often simply fatal. The historical record is thick with accounts of families who survived the cold only to be killed by the fire they lit to fight it. And then there were the hidden costs that modern people almost never consider. Water froze. Not just outdoor water, the water inside houses. Pitchers, buckets, the pump in the kitchen. Plumbing as we know it did not exist, But whatever water-carrying system a household depended on became unreliable or useless in deep cold. Ink froze in writers' inkwells. There are accounts of authors and lawyers and ministers warming their ink over a candle just to get through a morning's correspondence. Medicines, stored in unheated spaces, lost their potency or became useless. Bread dough wouldn't rise in a cold kitchen. The basic physical processes of daily life, writing, cooking, washing, sleeping, all became harder, slower, more effortful. This was the world that central heating would eventually abolish. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, room by room, building by building, city by city. The idea of moving heat from where it was generated to where it was needed is older than most people realize. It did not begin in 19th century America or even in industrial England. It began, as so many good ideas do, in ancient Rome. The Romans developed a system called the hypocaust, an underfloor heating technology that circulated hot air through hollow spaces beneath the floors and inside the walls of buildings. The word comes from the Latin for heated from below. Hot gases from a furnace, typically stoked by slaves, flowed through a raised floor supported by small brick pillars, heating the stone surface above. In the wealthiest Roman homes, and, more visibly, in the public bathhouses that were the social centers of Roman life, the hypocaust worked remarkably well. Roman bathhouses maintained reliably warm rooms even in the coldest European winters, and wealthy Romans sat on floors that were warm to the touch in January. But the hypocaust required constant labor and a dedicated furnace room, and it was enormously expensive to build. When the Roman Empire declined and the infrastructure that supported it collapsed, the hypocaust essentially vanished from Western Europe. The knowledge wasn't entirely lost. Medieval monasteries occasionally used rudimentary underfloor warming systems, and a few European nobles built variants. But for the vast majority of people in the 1,000 years following Rome's fall, the idea of distributed heat was simply not a practical option. You heated yourself near a fire. End of story. The real intellectual breakthrough, the insight that would eventually lead to modern central heating, came in the late 17th and early 18th centuries as European and then American engineers and natural philosophers began to think seriously about steam. Steam was already known to possess extraordinary mechanical force. The question was whether it could be made to carry heat as well as power. The answer, it turned out, was yes, and more efficiently than any previous system. The basic physics are straightforward. Water, when boiled, turns to steam, which carries a great deal of energy in a very small volume. If you pipe that steam from a boiler to radiators in distant rooms and allow it to condense back into water, it releases that energy as heat, then flows back to the boiler to be heated again. The system is elegant, self-circulating, and requires no moving parts beyond a pump in some configurations. It also operates at temperatures far higher than any simple warm air system, which means it can heat a large building effectively, even in severe cold. The first serious practical applications of steam heating appeared in England in the early decades of the 19th century, largely in industrial contexts, factories, mills, and large public buildings. American engineers watched and adapted. The technology crossed the Atlantic with the Industrial Revolution itself, arriving first in the cities of the Northeast, where the combination of cold winters, dense urban buildings, and growing industrial infrastructure made it both most necessary and most practical. The story of how central heating came to America runs through an unlikely place, a naval facility in Boston Harbor. The Charlestown Navy Yard, one of the oldest and most important shipbuilding facilities in the United States, faced a persistent and embarrassing problem. The Commandant's house, the official residence of the yard's commanding officer, was, by all accounts, essentially unlivable in winter. Boston winters are serious by any standard, and the house's fireplaces were simply not up to the task. Cold air infiltrated from every direction. The rooms furthest from the fireplaces were barely warmer than the outside. Naval commissioners, not a group known for prioritizing comfort, eventually acknowledged that the situation was untenable. In 1841, following a formal review, the commissioners approved an expensive installation of a central heating system for the commandant's house. It was a significant commitment, The technology was still relatively new, the installation costs were substantial, and there was genuine uncertainty about whether it would work as promised. But it did work. The system circulated heat through the building in a way that no collection of fireplaces could match. Rooms that had been abandoned in winter became usable. The temperature inside the house became something that could actually be managed rather than merely endured. The Navy Yard story is historically significant for a reason beyond the comfort of one admiral's household. It represents the moment when an American institution, a large, serious, technically sophisticated government operation, validated central heating as a real technology worth the investment. Government buildings, military facilities, and major public institutions were the early adopters of central heating in America, and their example mattered. When a naval yard or a state capital or a large hospital installed a central heating system and it worked, the technology gained credibility that no salesman's pitch could have provided. Throughout the 1840s and 1850s, central heating systems, primarily hot air furnaces that circulated warm air through metal ducts, and beginning slightly later, steam and hot water radiator systems, began appearing in American institutions. Schools, hospitals, government buildings, and the largest hotels were the vanguard. These were the buildings where engineers and architects first worked out the practical details of installation, where the early problems with the technology were discovered and solved, and where a generation of building owners and facility managers first learned what it felt like to work inside a building where the temperature was genuinely controlled. The technology spread from institutions to the wealthy private market in the second half of the 19th century. By the 1870s and 1880s, central heating in a private home was still an extravagance, a mark of serious wealth, but it was no longer an impossibility or an experiment. Wealthy families in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia were having steam or hot water systems installed in their townhouses. The coal-fired boiler sat in the basement. The pipes ran up through the walls. The radiators, cast iron, heavy, hot to the touch, stood in each room and quietly, reliably delivered warmth that a fireplace could never match. The cast iron radiator is one of the most underappreciated objects in the history of American domestic life. It is heavy, ugly by most modern standards, and almost entirely invisible to the people who have grown up around it. But it quietly reorganized the American house. Before central heating, the architecture of homes in cold climates was driven almost entirely by the need to keep heat in. Rooms were small to reduce the volume of air that needed warming. Ceilings were low for the same reason. Windows were kept small and few, not as a matter of aesthetics, but because every window was a point of heat loss. The central fireplace, in a colonial farmhouse, was not just a heating appliance. It was the organizing principle of the entire floor plan. Everything else was arranged around it. The radiator changed the equation completely. Once heat could be delivered to any room in the building through pipes in the wall, the architect was free. Rooms could be large, ceilings could be high, windows could be enormous. The great Victorian bay windows and floor-to-ceiling glass that we associate with the grandest homes of the late 19th century were only possible because a radiator stood beneath each one, counteracting the heat loss. The open floor plan, the sense of interior space and light that we still associate with desirable housing today, has its roots in the freedom that central heating gave to building designers. The radiator also changed the relationship between rooms in a house. In the fireplace era, a house was essentially a collection of separate thermal environments. The kitchen warm, the parlor tolerable if the fire was going, the bedrooms cold. You moved between these environments bundled up and braced for the change in temperature. In a centrally heated house, the temperature was essentially the same everywhere. You could walk from room to room in light clothing. This sounds trivial. It was not. It changed the way families moved through their homes, the way children played, the way adults worked and relaxed. It changed what people wore indoors. And there is a subtler architectural effect that historians have noted. The radiator allowed the kitchen to stop being the center of domestic life. Before central heating, the kitchen fire was the warmest place in the house, which meant it was where the family gathered, cooking, eating, socializing, sometimes sleeping. All of this happened near the kitchen hearth because that was where the warmth was. When every room was warm, the kitchen became a purely functional space. The parlor or living room, A room that existed in prosperous homes, but which had often been too cold for real daily use, became the actual center of family life. The shape of American domestic space, the way we think of the living room as the heart of the home, is a direct consequence of central heating. Central heating did not arrive equally. The wealthy got it first, as they always do with new technology, and the poor got it last, or not at all, for generations. The urban tenements of New York, Boston, Chicago, and Philadelphia in the second half of the 19th century were among the most densely populated and poorly heated residential environments in American history. A typical tenement apartment housed a family of 5, 6, or more in 2 or 3 small rooms. The building itself might have been built before central heating was practical, and its landlord had little incentive to retrofit it. Heating was the tenant's problem. The portable cast iron range, smaller and more manageable than a full kitchen stove, gave urban tenement dwellers a safer and more efficient alternative to an open hearth. But more efficient was a relative term. In a city, firewood was scarce and expensive, hauled from miles away through congested streets. Coal was more available and more affordable per unit of heat, but it still cost money that many tenement families simply didn't have in reliable supply. The choice between buying enough coal to stay warm through a cold week and having enough money for the week's food was not an abstract dilemma. It was a real calculation that millions of families made repeatedly every winter. Children suffered most visibly. The historical record of urban child mortality in the 19th century shows a consistent winter spike that tracks closely with temperature. Respiratory infections, which thrive in cold, damp environments and spread rapidly in crowded, poorly ventilated tenements, killed enormous numbers of children every winter. When Jacob Riis documented New York tenement life in the late 1880s and early 1890s, the cold was everywhere in his accounts, not as a backdrop but as an active force, shaping the conditions he described. The slow spread of central heating into working class and eventually tenement housing was driven partly by technology, partly by economics, and partly by municipal regulation. As steam and hot water heating systems became cheaper and more standardized, the cost of installing them in multi-unit buildings dropped. New York City, facing growing pressure from reformers and public health advocates, began requiring heating systems in new residential buildings starting in the early 20th century. Other cities followed. These were not just comfort regulations, they were public health measures, backed by clear evidence that heated buildings had lower rates of respiratory disease, lower rates of infant mortality, and lower rates of the cold-related deaths that the official records of the period tallied matter-of-factly each winter. The spread of central heating into the tenements and working-class housing of American cities is one of the least celebrated public health victories of the early 20th century. It did not generate headlines, it did not have a famous champion or a single defining moment. It was instead an incremental, structural improvement that quietly saved tens of thousands of lives over a few decades by making winter survivable for people for whom it had previously been a genuine mortal threat. The age of central heating was, for its first century, almost entirely the age of coal. And coal came with costs that were not immediately apparent to the people who benefited from the warmth it provided. Coal-burning boilers and furnaces, scaled to heat large buildings and eventually entire city blocks of buildings, filled the air above American cities with soot, sulfur dioxide, and particulate matter in concentrations that would be illegal under modern environmental law. The classic image of the 19th century industrial city, the dark, smoke-stained buildings, the perpetual haze, the sky that seemed never quite to achieve the blue you knew was there, was largely the product of coal combustion. Not just industrial coal, not just factory smokestacks, but domestic and commercial heating coal, burning in 1,000 basement furnaces across every city in the American Northeast and Midwest. Pittsburgh, which burned more coal per capita than perhaps any other American city in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, became so dark from coal smoke that streetlights had to be turned on at noon on many winter days. Residents described the soot that settled on everything, on windowsills, on laundry hung to dry, on children's faces after an hour outdoors. Medical studies of the period, limited by the diagnostic tools available, nonetheless showed elevated rates of respiratory disease in coal-burning cities. The warmth that coal provided was real and genuinely life-saving for millions of people. The air quality it destroyed was equally real, and it killed people by different means. The coal economy also shaped American geography, labor, and politics in ways that lasted well into the 20th century. The coal mining communities of Appalachia, western Pennsylvania, and the Midwest were built around the demand for heating fuel. The labor conflicts that defined American industrial history, the great coal strikes, the violence in the mining camps, the political battles over mine safety, were all in part a fight over who controlled the fuel that kept American homes warm. There is something striking about this. The desire for warmth, the most basic of human physical needs, generated an economy so large and so consequential that it shaped the political landscape of a continent. The miners who dug the coal that heated the homes of American cities were among the most dangerous and most poorly compensated workers in industrial history. Black lung disease, the progressive lung destruction caused by years of breathing coal dust, disabled and killed miners in numbers that dwarfed the dramatic accidents that occasionally made the newspapers. The warmth in a middle-class Boston parlor in 1890 had a human cost that no one in that parlor ever saw. This history is not a reason to mourn central heating. Its benefits, particularly for the urban poor, were enormous. It is simply a reminder that the technologies that feel most neutral, most invisible, most natural, the systems that simply keep us warm, are never actually free of consequence. For most Americans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, central heating arrived not as steam radiators, but as the hot air furnace, a cast-iron behemoth in the basement that sent warm air rising through floor registers into the rooms above. The gravity warm air furnace was, in its way, an ingenious simplification. It required no pumps, no complex pipe networks, no pressurized systems. A coal fire in the basement heated a large metal enclosure, the heat exchanger, and the warm air rose by natural convection through sheet metal ducts to floor registers scattered through the house. Cold air fell back to the basement through return ducts or simply through gaps in the floor, completing the circulation. The system worked because warm air rises. It needed nothing else. Operating one of these systems was a skilled domestic task. The furnace had to be banked at night, built up with a careful arrangement of coal and ash that would maintain a low, steady burn until morning, without going out and without burning too hot. It had to be shaken in the morning to drop the accumulated ash into the ash pan, then loaded with fresh coal for the day. Clinker, the fused, glassy residue of incompletely burned coal, had to be removed regularly or it would choke the fire. The ash pan had to be emptied. The flue had to be inspected. In a house without a furnace man, which was to say, in a working class or middle class house, all of this was the job of whoever woke up first, typically the husband of the household. There is a domestic technology history that rarely gets told, the story of the household labor that early central heating created, even as it eliminated other kinds. Before central heating, every adult in a cold climate household was involved in managing heat, collecting and stacking wood, tending fires, carrying coal. Central heating did not eliminate this labor, it concentrated it. The furnace became one person's job, typically and explicitly a masculine domestic responsibility in the culture of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. There are accounts from the period of the furnace as a specifically male domain, the basement as the husband's territory, the management of the furnace as a point of masculine competence and even pride. The introduction of automatic coal stokers, oil burners, and eventually gas furnaces in the 20th century gradually automated away this labor. Each technological step made the furnace slightly less demanding until, with modern gas and electric heat, the system requires essentially no attention at all. You set a thermostat and walk away. But this total automation, the reduction of heat management to a single small interaction with a dial or a phone app, is historically extraordinary. For most of human history, staying warm required constant physical effort. The thermostat, that small, ordinary object on the wall, represents the complete abolition of one of humanity's most ancient daily labors. The single most transformative object in the history of indoor heating is not the boiler, not the radiator, and not the furnace. It is the thermostat. Before thermostatic control, managing the temperature in a heated building was entirely manual. You made the fire bigger when you were cold and smaller when you were warm. You adjusted dampers, opened vents, and carried buckets of coal up and down basement stairs. The temperature of a room was always a negotiation between the fire's intensity and the house's leakiness, and it was always approximate. Too hot or too cold was the normal state. Exactly right was a brief accident. The first serious attempts to automate temperature control appeared in the mid-19th century, roughly concurrent with the spread of central heating itself. The principle of the thermostat is simple. A material that expands or contracts with temperature changes drives a mechanical switch that opens or closes a damper or valve. Bimetallic strips, which bend as two different metals expand at different rates when heated, became the core technology. By the latter half of the 19th century, rudimentary thermostatic controls were being applied to steam heating systems in larger buildings, the first step toward the idea that a building's temperature could be set rather than merely tended. Albert Butz, a Minneapolis inventor working in the 1880s, patented a damper flapper mechanism that automatically controlled a furnace's air supply based on room temperature. His company eventually became Honeywell, today one of the largest building control companies on Earth. The path from Butz's workshop in Minneapolis to the digital thermostats and smart home systems of the 21st century is direct and unbroken. What the thermostat did, in the deepest sense, was transfer control of indoor temperature from human effort to automatic mechanism. Before it, warmth was something you made. After it, warmth was something you set. This is a shift so fundamental that it barely registers as a shift at all. It simply feels like how things work. But the gap between the two states is centuries of human history. Millions of people whose daily lives were organized around the management of fire, and a physical effort so universal and so relentless that it shaped the architecture, the domestic culture, and the social structures of entire civilizations. The modern smart thermostat, which learns your preferences, adjusts to the weather forecast, and can be controlled from a phone while you're still at the office, is just the latest iteration of a process that has been running since Albert Butz rigged his first bimetallic strip to a furnace damper in a Minneapolis building in the 1880s. The goal has always been the same: to make warmth require as little human effort as possible. We are, in 2026, very close to achieving it completely. The effects of central heating ran far beyond the obvious comfort of warmer interiors. They rippled through medicine, education, labor, culture, and the very texture of daily life in ways that are still being mapped by historians. Consider sleep. Before central heating, the standard human sleep pattern, at least in cold climates, included a period in the middle of the night when the fire died and the house became dangerously cold. Historical accounts and sleep research both suggest that pre-industrial people in cold climates often woke in the night, engaged in quiet activity, prayer, conversation, reading by candlelight, and then returned to sleep as the cold deepened again. This segmented sleep, as historians call it, may have been partly driven by the necessity of tending the fire. When central heating stabilized nighttime temperatures, the fire no longer needed tending, and the pattern of sleep shifted toward the consolidated, single-block sleep that modern people consider normal. What we think of as natural sleep may, in part, be the sleep of a centrally heated house. Consider schooling. Before reliable central heating, the winter school year in rural America was deeply disrupted. Small schoolhouses with single wood or coal stoves were warm near the stove and cold everywhere else. Teachers angled their classrooms so students sat as close to the heat source as possible. Attendance dropped in the coldest weather because walking miles to school and sitting in a cold building was simply too physically demanding and too dangerous for young children. When schools gained reliable central heating, attendance stabilized through winter. The extension of effective schooling into the coldest months of the year, made possible by centrally heated school buildings, had measurable effects on educational outcomes for an entire generation of American children. Consider what happened to the bedroom. For most of human history in cold climates, the bedroom was a room designed to contain cold rather than resist it. Heavy curtains, bed hangings, fur coverlets, the communal warmth of multiple bodies in a shared sleeping space. The bed itself was designed to trap heat. The tall four-poster bed with its fabric hangings was not primarily decorative but thermal, creating a small warm microclimate within the larger cold room. As central heating spread to bedrooms, first in wealthy homes, then gradually everywhere, the bed lost its thermal function. The four-poster disappeared. Pajamas replaced the heavy nightclothes of previous centuries. The bedroom became simply a room, and the objects within it were free to serve aesthetic rather than survival purposes. And consider what happened to winter itself as a cultural and psychological experience. Before central heating, winter was not optional. You could not simply ignore it, stay inside, and maintain the pace of summer life. It interrupted everything: travel, commerce, social life, agriculture, construction. It set the rhythm of the year in a way that summer could not. Central heating did not eliminate winter, but it reduced it. It moved it outside. For most modern Americans, winter is something that happens beyond the glass of a window. Visible, aesthetically significant. Snow is beautiful when you're warm, but no longer physically menacing in daily life. The cold that once organized civilization has been domesticated. Here is the version of this story that doesn't get told in the triumphalist version. Central heating did not spread uniformly, and even today, in the 21st century, it is not universal. The American South, for most of its history, simply didn't have it, and didn't think it needed it. Southern winters are mild enough in most years that the open fireplace or the wood stove was considered adequate. Well into the 20th century, Southern homes were built with ventilation as the primary concern, not insulation. Fireplaces were present, but they were often decorative as much as functional, sized for the relatively rare cold snap rather than sustained winter cold. Central heating arrived in the South later, and it arrived alongside air conditioning, both as part of the same post-World War II renovation of American domestic comfort. But even in the North, even in the cities where steam heat arrived earliest and spread furthest, there were always pockets of exclusion. The rural poor, the migrant worker, the tenant farmer, these were populations for whom the central heating revolution happened on a different timeline, if it happened at all within their lifetimes. The uninsulated shack heated by a single kerosene stove, the farmhouse with a coal furnace that hadn't been serviced in a decade, the urban apartment where the landlord's boiler broke every January and was fixed slowly. These were realities for millions of Americans deep into the 20th century, long after central heating was considered simply normal. Globally, the picture is starker still. Central heating as Americans and Europeans know it, a system that maintains indoor temperatures above 60 degrees regardless of outdoor conditions, is a feature of wealthy, cold climate countries. For billions of people, staying warm in winter still means managing a fire, dressing in layers, and enduring temperatures that would seem intolerable to most modern Westerners. The international development literature notes that cold-related illness and death, most of it connected to inadequate indoor heating, remains a significant cause of excess winter mortality in countries across Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and large parts of the developing world. The problem that central heating solved for wealthy Americans in the 1840s is still unsolved for a large fraction of humanity. This is not a reason for guilt, it is a reason for perspective. The technologies we take for granted, the systems so ordinary we stop seeing them, often represent the resolution of problems that are still active and lethal in other parts of the world. Central heating is not a background feature of civilized life. It is a hard-won specific achievement, accomplished at real cost by specific people over specific decades of effort, and it is, still, not yet a universal human achievement. Walk through a modern house or apartment building and pay attention, for a moment, to everything you normally don't see. The vent in the floor, the register high on the wall, the baseboard heater that hums quietly on cold mornings, the thermostat on the hallway wall that you pass a dozen times a day without looking at, the pipes running through the walls that you've never seen and almost certainly never thought about. All of this, the entire hidden infrastructure of warmth, represents several centuries of accumulated engineering, institutional investment, and gradual technological refinement. It began with a Roman slave stoking a hypocaust beneath a bath floor. It passed through Benjamin Franklin's frustration with smoke and inefficiency. It ran through the coal mines of Pennsylvania and the steam-fitting shops of 19th century Boston. It was tested in a naval commandant's house in Charlestown in 1841. refined in the tenements of New York through the early 20th century, automated by an inventor in Minneapolis whose company would eventually become a global corporation, and delivered to your walls through millions of individual decisions made by architects, engineers, building inspectors, landlords, and municipal governments over generations. None of this history is visible in the object itself. The radiator doesn't tell you about the coal miners. The thermostat doesn't mention Albert Butts. The duct in the floor doesn't carry any trace of the Roman hypocaust that was its ancestor 2,000 years ago. The technology has been refined to invisibility, which is the highest achievement of any engineering project, a system so well designed and so reliably maintained that it stops being a system at all and becomes simply the way things are. But here is what it actually is. It is the reason your children have never woken up with frost inside their bedroom. It is the reason you have never had to choose between fuel and food in January. It is the reason your school day was never cancelled, because the classroom was too cold for children to learn. It is the reason you can wear light clothing in your own home in February and never once think about it. It is the resolution of a problem that was as old as the human settlement of cold climates and as universal as winter itself. The problem of how to stay warm enough to live, to think, to work, and to sleep through the darkest months of the year. That problem was not solved by a single inventor on a specific day. It was solved by the accumulation of thousands of individual improvements, institutional investments, and engineering decisions that stretched across centuries and continents. And the proof that it was solved is the fact that you never think about it. The greatest victory over cold in human history is so complete that it has become invisible. The most astonishing object in most people's homes is the one they've never noticed, the system in the walls, quietly doing the work that once organized entire civilizations around its management. Before central heating, cold was not a background condition. It was an active force that shaped architecture, organized labor, defined domestic space, limited education, and killed people in numbers that dwarf any modern equivalent. The story that runs from the Roman hypocaust to the smart thermostat on your wall is a story about one of the most fundamental human problems and a centuries-long effort to solve it. We live inside the solution so completely that we can't see the problem anymore. But it was real, it was brutal, and the invisible system in your walls is one of the most consequential inventions in the history of civilization. What other object in your home, something you pass every single day without thinking about it, has a history this deep? If you've made it this far, you already know you're someone who actually wants the answer. Subscribe, and we'll keep pulling threads.